And we are live. Well, it is now. We are done with week 10 of fantasy football. This is the Fantasy Football Forum, and we are here once again after a few week break. And I'm once again joined by my co host, Grant. Grant, we are now officially 2/3 of the way through a fantasy football season. It's prepping for week 11. How are we feeling headed into week 11 of this year's fantasy football season?
Man, me personally, I would make some moves. Made some trades last few weeks to get my team in a better spot. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing. I think we're seeing some more points being scored. I think overall, and seeing some of the point leaders that we expected start of the season kind of come out, especially with quarterbacks and yeah, it's been really interesting season so far. Records have been kind of weird with a lot of teams, just real football wise. But yeah, it's been a good fantasy year so far, and yeah, everybody's gearing up for the playoffs.
Both NFL and fantasy playoffs. Teams are
Mm-hmm.
gearing up, and like we've talked about
Mm-hmm.
earlier in earlier shows, it's now we have 10 data points for this season that we're banking our decisions off of, and this is when we start to see trends. But at the same time, if we look at certain teams, mainly the one that's in the forefront, the Denver Broncos, they are not the same team right now that we saw in September. So, um, understanding the differences of what a team is doing as a whole from the start to finish to what they're doing in the last 2 or 3 weeks to start building little mini trends inside our larger trend. That's kind of the key of building rosters to gear up for championships. So whether you're on top of your league record wise, you're sitting at 8-2, you're sitting at 9-1, you're sitting at whatever it is, and you're wanting to really make sure your team is bolstered for the playoffs, or you're barely scratching in the playoffs, or you need to solidify um, your position in your teams or your league's playoffs, or maybe you're on the outside looking in, but you really want to maybe knock somebody out of the playoffs because that's your hope. Then is you want to knock somebody out of the playoffs. So we have some strategies here going forward, and with most teams trade deadlines between now and week 13, maybe week 14, but hopefully it's not in the playoffs. um yeah, we've got some candidates. Are we buying or selling these players as we prep our
Mm.
teams for building into playoff contention? So, and part of this grant, it may be prefaced on maybe your team already in the playoffs and you're willing to take some risk at some higher name guys that are not doing as well, but you can get an owner that's needing a little bit more wins that you can take some cushion and hope for the best come playoff time. So
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. I think that with kind of what we're about to segue into, right, is you have your team, you have, like I said, you have the data points, you have 10 wins and losses, you figured out who's performing well on your team, who's consistent, who's not, right? So if you have done well, either through luck or your sheer ability to judge football players incredibly well, you might have on your bench 2 or 3 players that could be starters that you're having to kind of mentally decide, if I start, am I going to sit them, right? You're doing that mental exercise every week. Well, this is a good opportunity, like you mentioned, where we can take some of those players, package them with someone else, maybe get an upgrade at that position to kind of help, take a receiver that's maybe overall number 15, number 20. You trade package together, take the 2 players that helps another team, fulfills their needs, right, and gives you a better player in return.
yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking trades or we're talking buying, buying low on players or selling high on players, that's definitely part of the trade aspect. But I like what you said about maybe we can upgrade a position by getting a player that's comparable, but maybe also adding another player if we need it to build around it, or combining two players and getting one that, whether he's underperforming or overperforming, I mean, but the name value and what it looks like
Mm-hmm.
could, add up to you're getting a better player. And trading it's definitely an art, right? because you can't, if you go just by
Yes. Yep.
numbers, that says one thing. So just by numbers, just because the numbers say this is an equal trade, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right move for your trade partner. So evaluating what their needs are to know, and this is my personal opinion. I'll get on my soapbox and TED Talk here, but my personal opinion is if I can help another team in a need that they have for a position, while I'm also then helping my team in a need as well. So is it mutually beneficial? And that's, I think, that's a concept that I think is not really held with a lot of fantasy players or managers, just because it is a lot of, yes, how can I improve my team? But I also want to make sure this is a mutually beneficial, where if I still have a better outcome, that's great, but I'm not going to just, here's my bench. I would like a starter for that. Type
Yeah,
of trade. So,
exactly. And I think too, people have to realize that when you do trade, there obviously is an aspect of you want a better deal. You want to upgrade your players. Maybe your player you're trading away had a great week. That other team really likes that name or that brand or that, wow, he scored 50 points this week. Wow, I'm going to trade for him, right? There obviously is that aspect, right? But at the same
sure.
time, like most people have leagues where you're with these people for years, right? Like you're in the same league, like you're with friends, you're with family, coworkers, whatever it is. And you want people to treat you fairly. You want to treat others fairly. And so, like you mentioned, if you go after the needs of another team, especially being competitive, it's always fun to go after the needs of a team that's bad, right? So that way it's like they can get an upgrade on their team, but you're not threatened playoff wise, right? Or anything.
Right.
But still, like, find their needs, they're going to be happy, right, with the trade. Like, wow, I got these. I needed these two receivers because all my receivers were injured. Yeah, no problem. I'll give you this quarterback that I have that's on my bench. That's really good, right? So like that kind of thing is like everyone's happy versus like you kind of swindling and like debating and like wringing your hands over like, well, like this guy versus like A versus B player, you're going back and forth, and then someone gets butthurt about it, and then it's a whole thing, right? So there is that fine tuning and trading, which is important. And I think a lot of people like overall you have better trade experience, and when you trade with people in the future, they're going to respect you more and like be able to have more of an open mind.
And I mean, if you take a trade that you may have perceived to have lost, but you still think it's a fair trade, you at least upgraded a position, but you came about it in a way that you were also in a, what are the things that you have as far as a trade partner goes? And that goes a long ways to, like you just said, building rapport. And then down the road, I'm going to be able to potentially trade again with you. And I also may get a better deal because it's a mutually, beneficial thing for both players. So yeah, again, an art form. We like to take numbers and say, based on the numbers, this is what's going to happen. And we all know in football, it's not a fully just round ball. It's a different shape. It's oblong. And the way it bounces kind of is lucky a little bit. So we have to take that in consideration too. So, all right. So let's start with some big names here that are on people's radars of, maybe you drafted these guys super high and you're really disappointed with them now, but players that we're either buying or selling, and we'll give are we going to buy them or sell? Why? And then if we're buying, who are we willing to give up for this player? Or for selling, who do we want back? So I'll start us out. I'm going to start us out with a hot topic running back, and it's not Tony Pollard that I'll start us out with. Everybody's talking about Tony Pollard. We all know what the situation with Tony Pollard is. So, but Saquon Barkley, running back for the Giants. Are we buying or selling Saquon Barkley?
Oh man, it's a great question. Without really like diving into that team and doing everything, I think it depends on how desperate you are. If you're buying or selling, I think if you drafted him, you're really frustrated because you picked him up in the second round and he's performing, between the 20 and 30 spot, right, of running backs. So I'm kind of at the point where we'll talk about this more with all these comparisons, like sunk costs. It's almost like if you have them, you're like, the talent's there. Like, what do I do? I'm probably trying to sell him, package him with something else, and trying to just change because the Giants are a hot mess right now. And
Mm-hmm.
you might be able to just sell the name of Saquon and be able to kind of get someone equivalent. Maybe you can do Saquon plus another player for like a Josh Jacobs or someone, right? Where it's similar team situation that's a little more unstable, uncertainty at running back, right? But maybe you get some more upside. But yeah, I'm trying to sell, I think, if I have him.
Trying to sell. Okay. So
I think so.
currently Saquon Barkley, he has played almost 80% of the snaps for the Giants this year. And that gives him, he's at 375 for this season so far. So I would also say I'm selling simply because I think with the injuries that have been there with the Giants, it's mainly to the quarterbacks, and they're going to start DeVito now at quarterback. I would say teams don't have to mask what they're going to do. They can front load a box. Saquon Barkley is a talented enough running back that, 8 stacked boxes really don't necessarily hurt him, but there's also very little on the receiving core. Darren Waller's been hurt. Wan'Dale Robinson is their best wide receiver. So I would say I'd sell based on name recognition, but if I'm able to get a player like Josh Jacobs where it's a better offensive situation and I'm going to improve it, but I'm also going to send a player that has a high caliber name, I think that's a deal that can get done. And I do think it does depend on, if you're drafted Saquon Barkley, your team's clawing to get into the playoffs, you need a spark. That could be that spark that, hey, I'm going to get rid of this guy and get him off my bench. So the argument to buy, I wouldn't agree with, which is why I'm selling. The only argument I can find to buy is based on volume, and he's the only one that gets there. That can work sometimes, but I think it's a flawed argument where what if it doesn't? What if that volume just doesn't get there? But if you're selling him, don't use that argument. Use the argument of, hey, he is the only one there. Who else is going to get, touches? So that could be the argument to try to sell. But I think it's a flawed one, which is why I'm not buying. So.
Yep. I agree. And you might have to, like we mentioned before, like when you're trying to sell a player like this, you might have to just understand based upon output, you might have to go after like a Chuba Hubbard plus someone else, right? And understand that like the names, you have to remove the names, which we'll talk about a little more, kind of like a fun little game that we'll play. But like you remove the names and look at stats. Like how do these players compare? And when selling, you want to use the name to your advantage. When buying, you want to try to look at stats, right? Because if you're trying to buy Saquon, you're like, all right, well, like, what's his volume? What's his touches? What's all these things? And the seller is like, well, he's Saquon. Like, he's going to be great. He's had a bad offensive line his whole career, blah, blah, right? They're going to say all those things.
Yep. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, let's stay with the running back position. We'll buy and sell. We'll do a few running backs here. But are you buying or selling David Montgomery with the Lions?
Oh,
man.
man.
Gonna make these easy. These are going to be tough calls.
No, these are good. These are really good. Calls. This is also good because in our league, I have both, and I'm starting both right now. So both Jahmyr Gibbs and Dave Montgomery. So
situation, right? Dave Montgomery is still playing after he's back from injury, so he's back. Jahmyr Gibbs' role, though, this last game increased. He outsnapped David Montgomery. Montgomery had the 75-yard touchdown this week. So do we see kind of a 1A, 1B, or do we see Montgomery yield more snaps to Gibbs? Yep. So based on that, are we buying or selling based on what?
I'm probably selling simply because I think Gibbs is more explosive. I think Montgomery's a great player.
Yep.
I think that he benefited a lot on some games early in the year against Green Bay, Carolina, where he took advantage of a good offensive line and just getting the ball like 30 times because Gibbs was out, right? Literally all the volume. And he had two very good games, like almost 55 plus fantasy points in two games, those two games. And of course, he then gets injured, then Gibbs comes back, right? So I think the 75-yard run in the Chargers game equated for 13 of his 17 points he scored right on Sunday. So to me, that's one run. Obviously, you don't want to play the game of like, well, if you remove X, Y, and Z, the player doesn't score, because a lot of fantasy is like, that's a lot of explosive plays are part of football, right? So you can't play that game, but he scores 4 points if he's not in that snap, and Gibbs is in there and does 10 runs, right? So to me, I would probably be selling Montgomery, being like, hey, he's still the lead back. He's Gibbs, they're going to kind of equalize, or Montgomery's like coming back from his injury. They're going to be 50-50, split, all this stuff. I would probably try to sell. If your team doesn't have a lot of options, not the worst flex to keep. So that's kind of my other thing is like, I think sell for sure. If you can't sell, I think it's a reliable flex. That's what you're going to get. You're going to get like 6 points. You might get 20 because he might play more with game script. You don't know.
Yep. No. And we shouldn't try to predict game script. But so I'm going to put a caveat to this. I'm going to kind of chicken out. If I'm a team that's running back needy, so let's say I had Nick Chubb and he got hurt, and I've been trying to search for another running back, and I'm desperate. In that scenario, he's a buy to me because, yes, he may yield some snaps now to Gibbs, but it looked like on Sunday they were splitting. Basically, they were splitting off just when the team was on the field. So one series belonged to Gibbs, one series belonged to Montgomery, and that's how it split up. That's one game that we see both of them in this new role after Gibbs has been, basically shot out of a canyon while Montgomery is out. So based upon that, I'm willing to buy, but I also am not going to buy at a high price. I'm not going to pay, the price tag it would have been had it been week 4, week 5, before the injury happened. So if I can maybe trade off, if I'm heavy on wide receiver, or maybe the team is needy on tight end, then I can swap positions to where I'm upgrading position that way. I don't necessarily have a crossing point, but maybe it's a Tyler Lockett type where it's a wide receiver 2 with some upside. That then you're getting a running back 2, but at minimum a flex position. Now, if I have plenty of running back options, right, I'm going to look to sell because the upside's not there for Montgomery as it is for Gibbs. He doesn't have the pass catching ability the same as Gibbs has. He's not used in that way. He can, but it's just not going to be what they call for him. They're going to call that for Gibbs, not for Montgomery. So I could see it going both ways, depending on your need. Personally, I'd probably sell, but before the bottom falls out. But I also don't know that the bottom's going to fall out because this is a good team. So we want players on good teams. So you can make a case for either way to do it. So it just depends on your team needs for this one. So that's my take on it. What's your team needs, whether you are or not?
A good one. And I have another one that's similar. You might have it on your schedule.
All right, go for it.
Jaylen Warren and Najee. Because that is very similar to, with some differences, obviously, but similar situation where you have kind of the defined starter, and then Jaylen, who's been the backup for a couple years, and now all of a sudden, Steelers offense is picking up. They're 6-3. Both running backs are getting carries, are getting touchdowns.
Yep.
They're catching the ball. What are you doing with Steelers running backs right now?
Well, I think I heard Jaylen Warren was now officially named the starter. I don't know. You may have to fact check that on me, but if that's the case, The only thing that changes is he then gets the first rep at the ball or at the
Mhm.
carries. It could mean that there's a change in the guard. We've all been wanting it. And I think this last week was the first time Warren outsnapped Harris. I think that's been the first time since any injuries have done that. So typically it's been Harris that's outsnapped Warren. So if I'm a Najee Harris manager, I'm probably trying to sell, but I'm probably gonna have to understand that the market value for him is so low because he's now the 1B
Yeah.
in a not as good offense. So I have to be ready for I can't get draft price for that. And I am probably
Yeah.
holding. If I have Warren, I'm holding him. Otherwise, I would buy him. If somebody's willing to, take a fair deal for it, I'm going to buy Warren because he is the better back. So that would be my
Mm.
thought.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. I do think that's a really interesting situation because with the Lions, it's been more of like who's on fire and who's injured, right? Whereas the Steelers, it's kind of been for most of the season they've been healthy. It's now been more of just like one's kind of emerging as more consistent, more productive back, right? And
Right.
so similar thing but different. Where if you like you mentioned, if you got Jalen Warren, I think you are hopefully flexing him if you have that available, which is not a bad idea, or it's a buy-in fill week, right? I agree with you there. Is if you could sell him, being like, hey, he's out snapping. I think he scored 17 fantasy points last week, so he's productive, right? He scored a touchdown, right? He had a good yardage. Like you can use those metrics and try to sell, and then maybe ends up being a target share, right, or carry share,
Yep.
right, where they kind of level out more. But yeah, I agree with you. Is like the trends are heading different directions for both of those players, opposite what they were in preseason.
So if you're a Harris owner, and let's say you're not the Harris owner, let's say you're the manager that has James Cook, and the Harris owner comes and says, "Hey, would you take Najee for Cook?" Is that a straight up, or is that a no deal, or do you have to change that?
Cook for that's man, that's a good one. I
Both
don't know
are,
if I'm the Harris owner, I'm probably taking that. I would want to take it straight up if I could, right?
yeah.
But if you're the Cook owner, you're probably wanting a little extra. I would assume.
You'd
You'd want
want
like
a
a wide
yeah,
receiver 3 or like a bench threat or something, right? But yeah, I mean, if I'm the Najee owner, I'm taking that heartbeat. I feel like.
sure. So in that respect, the Najee Harris or the Najee owner or manager is getting the better end of that deal. The Cook, because those are two
Yeah.
relatively close backs of both RB2s.
Mm-hmm.
Cook probably has a little more solidification in his role, although we've seen Latavius Murray come in and take some goal line work, and they've
Mm-hmm.
signed Leonard Fournette, so there's not any without risk there. So if you're the Gus Edwards owner and the Harris manager comes to you, is that a straight up deal, or do you need to change that if you're the Gus Edwards manager?
Ooh, God, that's tough. The Gus Edwards Justice Hill situation is complicated with the Ravens. I think what makes it extra complicated is the fact that you also have a running quarterback that's involved with the
Yep.
situation that has been inconsistent. And like Lamar, it's been a really weird season for him the last few weeks, at least, where I feel like the Ravens will score, 30 points and he'll have like 13 fantasy points and then he'll, play bad. And then like, there's no correlation to like game script or scoring or anything
Yep.
with Lamar. And so that's translating to the running game where it's like some weeks it's great and some weeks like it just, I don't know. It's a weird offense right now for if you have
Well,
Ravens players.
and add into Keontae Mitchell, where he is also up and coming. So you have almost a three-headed back where Gus Edwards has scored a lot of points, but he is doing the Jamal Williams role that he did last year, where it's mainly touchdowns. So if you're scared of that,
Yes.
you may say, I'll take the usage of, even if it's a 1B back, where I think the Harris owner is just trying to get out of a bad situation, but landing themselves in another bad situation. So, yeah, all depends on perspective here. But again, these players not drafted anywhere near each other, but also goes why we shouldn't hold draft value, especially this late in the season, where we have to look at what's production. So you have a quarterback that you want to run this experiment on. Are we buying or selling? Is there a quarterback you're either buying or selling?
Yes. So quarterbacks, especially, I have 10 data points in a lot of leagues. I think in standard leagues, 4-point scoring, right? Mm-hmm. They often can get overlooked because you want consistency, right? You want the Geno Smith of last year. You want the 20 points a game every week, plodding along. Fantastic. Obviously, you pay a premium for a Josh Allen, a Jalen Hurts, a Mahomes, right? And with the hopes that you get those 30, 35-point games that are great. So to me, I mean, if people have been watching the NFL this year, we've known that the Chiefs have not been as explosive on offense. The defense has been better. And the Chiefs are still winning games thanks to the balancing act of Mahomes is being a little more reckless with his throwing. Receiver chemistry we're still figuring all that out. And then the defense, though, has been stepping up and getting stops and doing well against high-powered offenses. Yep. And so for me, if you are a team that is a borderline playoff team, or you're on the outside looking in and you're trying to make immediate moves, I think it's a great time to evaluate Patrick Mahomes on a buy-sell market for a couple of reasons. One, you look at him as the 5th overall. He's the 5th or 6th, depends upon your scoring overall QB in fantasy, which is great. Those are great numbers, right?
Yep.
But you can look at other non-traditional quarterbacks. Sam Howell, I think, is one. CJ Stroud has been so explosive. I think he's way more popular of a choice, right, than Sam Howell. But you look at Sam Howell, for example, he's the passing leader in the NFL with 2,700 yards. So you look at that and you're like, wow, Washington Commanders quarterback, this is crazy. I think in that perspective, he's quarterback number 3, right? So going back to we're talking about the quarterbacks, is like buy, sell. It's like, okay, you have Mahomes, right? Are you like, so Jeff, for your league, what are you doing? Let's say you've got Mahomes, you're kind of like a 6-4, maybe a 5-4, 5-5 team, something like that. You're on the edge of playoffs. Like, do you think his schedule is worth the buy to trade for him, or will you try to sell and potentially look at getting an upgrade at a skill position plus stream quarterbacks, or maybe pick up a no-name quarterback?
So I think this is interesting. I think if I'm on the outside looking in, right, I'm trying to maybe make the playoffs. I'm trying to bolster my team, and I need some skill positions. I obviously have a lot of draft capital in my quarterback position. I'm looking at Patrick Mahomes, and this is regression. He is regressing from what we saw last year, and this is something should be expected. He's not having a bad season, right? He is quarterback by total fantasy points, right? He is quarterback 8 on the season in scoring in PPR format. So maybe this is the case. I can say I'll take Patrick Mahomes, but I want Joshua Dobbs plus a wide receiver 1. I'm saying that Joshua Dobbs sits at quarterback 7, right above Patrick Mahomes in total points for the season. That's a name value recognition, and it's a decent offense that's getting upgraded at wide receiver soon with Jefferson coming back. The Chiefs don't have the worst quarterback schedule, they also don't have a favorable one towards the stretch. So I'm going to see if I can bolster my team. Say, can I get a wide receiver 1 and maybe a guy that is playing really well, but we still have questions on it. It's a risk because while, I mean, that's how I frame it to the trade partner is, look, Mahomes has a 40-point ceiling week in, week out. Dobbs may or may not, because as Arizona face more team, we have more, we have more film on this guy. He hasn't really produced consistently. So it's a risk.
Yeah.
Straight numbers by pure just fantasy points total, Dobbs is higher than Mahomes. But we're looking at a lot more. So that's what I would be looking at. What's a favorable thing that then I can bolster another? I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to take a downgrade, but I'm going to upgrade another position by doing that.
Interesting. I like that. So here's a trade suggestion for you. Let me know what you think about this. Let's say you have Mahomes, right? And you have, let's say, Najee, which I just talked about him, right? You got Mahomes and Najee, and you want an upgrade. You got quarterback covered with another quarterback. Let's just say hypothetically, it's, like let's a Dobbs or a Sam Howell, right? Or CJ Stroud, one of those guys, right?
Yeah.
So would you want that RB1, right? Maybe, and also maybe a backup. So here's a trade option. Would you trade away Mahomes and Najee, receive Travis Etienne, and like Kareem Hunt? So that is an option where you can take advantage. We talked about the name at the start of the show today, right? And you mentioned the regression. So like you're selling the name, right? You have your quarterback spot covered. You are getting a very good running back and a veteran running back who's experienced, where if the starter, who's Ford, gets hurt, can't play, you have someone who's familiar with the offense the last few years, who has been scoring touchdowns, right? He's not getting the carries, but he's scoring touchdowns each week, right? With Kareem Hunt, able to help your team out. You upgraded at running back, and you basically sold for like a top 5 running back in the league, right? And for your quarterback position.
In that trade, I'm taking the ETN side.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at not just, they had Jacksonville had a bad game last week against San Francisco. If you look historically, most teams have had bad games against San Francisco. It's good defense, but the schedule is very favorable, being in the NFC South now. So I would take the ETN side. So that would be the trade I would do. And you're also giving value there as well. Patrick Mahomes still has value, even on a bad game. On most of his bad games, you're still at least 15 to 20 points. So that's what people are doing if they're streaming quarterbacks. So you're not even you're saying like, whoa, you're streaming a quarterback. And that's that worst case scenario. So
yeah, and I think too is most leagues, unless you're in a super flex, right, where you've got 2 quarterbacks on your team for every team that's in your league, for most part, people have their quarterbacks, right? And unless you draft like an Aaron Rodgers at the start, or you panic with Burrow and you traded him away or something, and you got creative, right, because you freaked out. There are plenty of options, and this is the point in the year where I haven't always been good about looking at like a Dobbs, right, with the Vikings, who is now, 2 weeks ago, he didn't take a snap under center until an hour before the game, right? Like that's he didn't practice the center. He didn't know the cadence, right? He didn't know anybody's names. Comes in, he scored, 30 fantasy points last 2 weeks. So that's not going to happen every week. We know that, right? People get film on him. They're going to understand his offense and everything, but you have a waiver pickup that's scoring you 30 points, and all of a sudden you can sell Mahomes, which you mentioned, quarterback 8, going back to we talked about in multiple different segments about value when drafted, right? You drafted Mahomes, depends on the league, 2nd, 3rd round, Probably, right? Superflex
Yep.
obviously is higher, but like a standard half point PPR league, it's second or third round, right? As the first quarterback off the board, right? You didn't draft him as 8. 8 was going to be like Aaron Rodgers, like it all like that tier, right? Where it's like, okay, Matthew Stafford, right? Like you're going through like after the Jalen Hurts, the Josh Allens, like the Joe Burrows, right? The Justin Herberts. There's like that was like the top tier with Mahomes, right? And then there's like this next tier below that that was all these other quarterbacks. And right now Mahomes is playing in that tier. So if you can sell the brand and get an RB1, and here's the difference too, which is key, right? Is looking at this is an RB3 with ETN on the season based on 10 games. You're not buying the number one preseason draft pick who could be, like all over the place, right? Like Eckler or something where he's like, he's great if he's healthy, but who knows, right? It's like you're drafting someone who's had 10 games and has a good schedule, right? Like you can take advantage of that, sell the name, right? And stream someone. It's riskier, sure, but if your team needs help, and you got to take care of that.
Yeah. Well, and he is RB3, Travis Etienne, by 0.3 points to Raheem Mostert. So you're talking almost the RB2 by total points.
Yeah, and you would assume Mostert too because of Achane coming back, right?
Yep.
He's gonna probably not be. I mean, I would assume, and maybe the Dolphins do, but he's not gonna be scoring his 30, 40 points a game he was doing at the start of the season to kind of not his numbers are inflated, right? Because obviously it's running back, so still running the ball, but there were some games there where it really boosted his ranking, and I think he's gonna kind of take that 10, 15 point range from now on, and rather than that higher ceiling we saw at the start of the season.
Well, and this is an interesting to understand the difference between total points scored versus points per game. Total points can look deceptive, where points per game kind of gives a better story. I think the best way to evaluate what a player is, you mentioned you can't just take out the best game, but if you take out a player's best game and their worst game, and you aggregate everything else, and you take that median of what everything else was, that's a close representation of what that player is. So that's going to be that should be your basis then on why I would like this player or not, based on I'm taking out their very best and I'm going to take out their worst. And then I'm going to divide it up between the rest of the data points that I have. That's just
exactly.
It's a flawed way to evaluate it, but it's a really quick way if you're in a pinch to say, what do I need to do and how do I figure if this is actually a good deal? So,
well, and same with anything else, right? Like this could happen in the NBA, it happens in Major League Baseball, it happens in NFL, whatever it is. Like game script situations outside of the player's control happen.
Yep.
And the player doesn't perform. That's just how it works. It's not and oftentimes it's not related to the player's performance. It could be that like, hey, the Chiefs are, for example, Mahomes, they're running the ball well, right? They're getting 5-6 yards a clip, right? They're not going to want to throw the ball, risk turnovers, run the clock out, score touchdowns. Mahomes might score 8 points and throw for 200 yards, no touchdowns. But like that's a victim of game script. It's not, wow, you had a bad game. So I agree with you. Is like you want to take out the outliers. Look at the body work from a consistency, because there's gonna be hills and valleys. Like you had the infamous Joe Mixon 50-point burger that he's gonna drop at some point, right? Where it's like, wow, he finished RB9 on the season or 8. It's like, well, he would have been like 15 or something if he didn't have this massive game that just all these situations happened. The Bengals ran over some random team, right? So I agree with you. I think taking out the hills and the valleys, look at the body of work, is a much better evaluation tool than saying like, wow, he scored 5 points last game, he's trash, we're going to toss him, we're going to try to find someone else.
And this is then, I think it's a talking point for the offseason too. Like in-season scripts, also a talking point for the offseason when we're given information of player X, what last year finishes the RB9. Okay, great. If you look at each particular game, how did that do? Joe Mixon's a great point of that last year where he had over 50 points in a game. That won you that week, but every other week it wasn't really that great. So should he be above certain other running backs because of, well, total points? He was this RB last year. Well, that's where you can make the argument then of should he have been? And but then we get a clearer picture when we start taking out the very best and the very worst and say this is overall what we should expect from this player going forward. And of course, there's other factors when it comes to draft season of if a team, if it's a situation change with a coach or it's a situation change for a player, like all of that plays into factor. But it's a better tool than to evaluate what's the potential average I'm going to get out of this player. So
Definitely. And then I guess another, I guess, slight caveat too, maybe we want to talk about is we're on the subject of trading, on the subject of like using brands to evaluate players. So when you're looking at trades, most leagues have a trade deadline a week, maybe the week of, the week before the playoffs, right? Because obviously, if the team's out, they might sell the team just to be stupid, and it influences the game, right? So week before, but like we're at the point where the last third of the fantasy season, right? At what point are you trying to get your trades figured out and done? Because obviously, the closer you get to playoffs, that player's value is more fixed, right? So the swings don't happen as much because, like, well, he's had 13 games of work. Now we've had 10, right? So we're getting close to that point. But like, at what point are you like, I'm not doing any more trading? I feel good with my team before, or you kind of constantly feeling people out. You know what I'm saying? Like, at what point is a good time to say I'm good? Like, I'm not going to trade because I'm going to overextend myself or because I'm bored, right?
I think it's, to me, I'm going to stop looking for trades once the trade deadline hits. However, I'm going to evaluate my team's needs. And especially going into playoffs, what I would like is to have a positional advantage where if I'm starting two running backs, can I start a low end RB1 in my RB2 spot? Can I trade up? Can I try to trade up? That's very hard to do when you take the path of trading that I outlined earlier of where's that mutually beneficial line at, right? So let's run this thought experiment on running backs real quick. You have a running back A who is on average this year scoring 17.3 points. The running back B is scoring 15.2 points a game. The rush yards average, right? Player A, who's scoring 17.3 points, he's averaging about 65 rush yards a game, whereas B is 72. And I have player A currently on it would be running. I want to do scoring, running back scoring. Player A is currently number 8 in running back scoring. Player B is 24. Which one do you want to have?
Said player A is 8th in scoring.
Yep.
Man, I mean, I would think I like B's stats better, right? I like the higher rushing yards per game. I feel like A has gotten more touchdowns or catches, which has influenced the stats. So I think at this point, while touchdown regression is a thing, at this point, if there are significant touchdowns that are happening each game or catches, right, I would probably prefer player A. Also realizing if I knew the names of these players, then I'm probably understanding like, oh, I wouldn't pay the value for this player or whatever, right? But
right.
I mean, I think let me back up. Removing touchdowns, I prefer player B. I like the higher rush yards. Higher rush yards tend to indicate a better run game, and it gets better ball control. Indicates that the quarterback is not throwing the ball as much, right? So like all those things are good.
Yep.
From a rush yards perspective, I would prefer B, but I think A has some weird, quirky stats of like catching the ball a lot, or a lot of touchdowns or something.
Yeah, so that actually plays into it. Where player A is Rachaad White, who is not known for
Ooh.
being a very good runner, but he catches a lot of passes. So in PPR formats, he's very useful. Player B is Saquon Barkley.
Ooh.
So from
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
we just talked about
Yep.
earlier, a sell Saquon Barkley. Can
Yep.
you get Rachaad White plus maybe a
Yep.
wide receiver 2, and therefore you're bolstering a team
Yeah.
that leading into the playoffs, like, hey,
Yes.
I'm going to get rid of this player because there is big name value recognition, and there's value there with Saquon. I'm not saying there's not, but you're taking a bit of a, can I bolster another position? Can I get a wide receiver plus a running back that is scoring a lot of points? It's doing it in a quote unquote unconventional way for running back, but it's there. We have the data right now that shows it's there. So yeah, those are fun. And it's not fair to just throw out certain stats and say, well, this is it. But sometimes that's what we're dealt with when we're talking trades of like, well, this player's this player's that. And when you take the names out of it, like you said, you prefer Saquon for the rushing. Agreed. But for point scoring, when we're getting into the playoffs, how are the points being scored? What's going on? Rachaad White is scoring those points. And that's just a fact at this point.
Yeah, and I agree. And it brings you back to a good point of with running backs, it's not really how the points happen.
Right.
It's that the points happen. Right? So great question is like 5 years ago, James White, Patriots. Perfect example, right? He was the third down back, and it was crazy usage. It was the weirdest thing. It was like he'd rush for 15, 20 yards a game, catch like 10 passes for like 60 or 70 yards, have like a 11, 10, 11, 12 point fantasy game every single week, like one of the most reliable flex plays in your lineup. But he'd have 15 yards rushing a game, right?
Yeah.
And it was one of those situations where it's like he was a dump off valve for Brady, and it worked out great.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's always those players. Right now, we have to start identifying of who are the players that are going to be that linchpin in your flex position or going to combat. Like there's those players that, the Christian McCaffreys or whoever it is, the Travis Etienne's, players that they are helping win championships. But who are the players that are helping you defeat those teams? Like who's those players? So kind of like it's a little fun. So on a wide receiver position though. So we'll do a blind and then I got one buy or sell then. Since we're coming up on time here soon. But we'll go wide receiver A, scoring 17.5 points per game. And then wide receiver B is scoring 19.9, so almost 20 points a game on average. Both are under a half a touchdown a game on average. And both get about 7 receptions a game on average. Now, total, I do want to put this targets. Player A is second in targets in the league. Okay. And then player B is tied for 11th. So player A has 99 targets and player B has 86. And then on scoring, they are 5th and 6th in scoring. So they're very close. So this is a matter of very close. So it would be a matter of who has the better, in my opinion, who has the better playoff schedule.
Gosh, I mean, I'm with running backs. I love to see receptions. I love to see usage. I'm sorry. I meant wide receivers. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm brain fart there. So with receivers, I love to see receptions. I love to see targets. I think even though there's a 2-point variance, I would still want to go with the higher receptions I think player A, I think that's that person, right? Who had the more receptions but less fantasy points a game, right? Was
Yes.
because I would think that the law averages states those are going to turn into like yards after catch, a touchdown, right? Like the more time your player touches the ball, the more often that they can pull move on some guy and get a 30-yard pass. Yeah, exactly.
So player A is Ja'Marr Chase. And I point to him as he had a very down first couple weeks and not sure where people are at on him now. Player B has caught fire, though, and it's CeeDee Lamb.
Wow.
So to me, it's a close one.
Yeah,
they weren't this close at the beginning of the season, though. But that one's not really hey, I can use this to trade up and do this. But this goes if somebody's trying to really downplay what Ja'Marr Chase is doing. I actually agree with what you said. He's getting targets. Players that are getting the targets on their team. So obviously it's the wide receiver ones. There are a couple that I have here that are we buying or selling that are wide receiver ones on their team. And we may be kind of down on them, but they have favorable matchups, especially during the playoffs and opportunity. They're out there running routes. They're getting targets. That leads to opportunity. Wide receivers are going to have some level of variance just because, like you said, game script could lead to they just aren't needed that game. So that could happen. But in regard to a wide receiver, are we buying or selling? Are we buying or selling Michael Pittman?
Ooh. That's a great question. I think this goes back to the Steelers running back situation. I think it depends on what you need from your team and looking at the situation. I would say overall, as a wide receiver one, you definitely, I think you'd want some more production, right, from that spot. If you drafted him that way, maybe so you went RB heavy or whatever. At the same time, I think based on the name and just the way the offense is, if you can, snag him, he's I think 10, he's between like 10 and 12, I think right now, wide receiver, overall in points. So
overall in points,
is that right?
Wide receiver, he is
somewhere like around 10, right? I think
he's 11.
Okay. So like you wanted, I mean, again, as a wide receiver one, I think you wanted a little more production but also two, because he's with the Colts, because he's in a situation that offense doesn't look good on paper. I think it's a great time to buy if you can, because I just believe that people could be like, well, it's the Colts, fine, I'll trade someone, right? And then all of a sudden you can maybe grab him for a running back like we talked about. Maybe you got a Najee or someone else, maybe a Montgomery, right? That's kind of like you think sliding down. I mean, I think a Pittman for Montgomery trade is a very fair trade, especially if it's a need for a need, and especially if you need a receiver need that fills that void.
Right. Michael Pittman also is third, by the way, in targets this year, tied with Devontae Adams at 98.
Wow. It's a lot.
It's a lot of targets, but he doesn't get talked in the same tier as, by the way, Stephon Diggs leads the league in targets at 102. So Pittman doesn't get
not that far away. It's like 4.
No, he's not So he doesn't get talked about in the same tier as the Pittmans, the Chases, the AJ Browns, all of that. But he's getting the targets, he's getting the opportunity. So yeah, it's an interesting one because Pittman is definitely one of those players that is seen as a lower quality wide receiver. Whereas
and I think
Oh
no, I was just saying, like, I guess something to do with also the sexiness of the offense, right? I think running backs, as managers, it's like, oh, well, it's like Saquon, and he does well regardless. It's more the name of the running back. But I think for receivers, it's definitely like the offense. It's the Eagles or the Bills or the Chiefs or the Bengals or like the Chargers, right? It's like, oh, they have this great quarterback who's slinging the ball around, and you forget that there's a lot of really good running back or receivers, excuse me, that can provide great value at later rounds. You're not paying that first, second round price. You still get like a top 10. So you go RB heavy for whatever reason, right?
Yep.
You could do like an Eckler, Aaron Jones, or whatever you want to do with your turn, and then get Pittman in like the third or fourth round, and you have a top 10 receiver, right? And that would work out great for your team.
And it's not going to be that way always, but definitely
No.
that is definitely that's the strategy you want to take when you're drafting, is understanding through the seasons what is going on with what's the potential with each of these. So before we log off here, any other players you want to have questions about, or you want to let's talk through real quick buying, selling, trade targets?
Trade targets. I have another quarterback for you, Joe Burrow. Are you buying or selling? After the injury, after the ankle, he's come on strong, right? So what are your thoughts? For Joe Burrow, are you buying or selling?
So I'm buying, but I also know if I'm buying, the team that has him is probably not going to sell very low because he has been playing better as of late. The team is coming out stronger. Now, if I'm approaching the team that drafted Burrow, the edge here is they probably have had to have secondary quarterback thoughts. What are they doing? And they may have had some struggles because they're playing Joe Burrow because it's name recognition, and I'm not playing my backup because Joe Burrow is Joe Burrow. He's going to be fine, and eventually he is. So, but if I could maybe I have CJ Stroud, and I'm wanting to sell high and saying, look, I'll give you CJ Stroud, and there's another positional need. Say it's a running back or wide receiver. I'll give you those two. I want Joe Burrow. Now, it's a pretty dangerous game just because CJ Stroud, I will admit it, he is lighting the quarterback world on fire like we haven't seen since Mahomes in his first year start. That is happening, but that's also where you could take a player like that has some hot name recognition right now, saying, look, this is a real quarterback. He's been doing this. He just did it against the Bengals. But I want Burrow, and I'll give him plus not a high quality, but an additional piece to get the name. And I think there's safety there though. So it's a risk because especially if it's a team on the outside looking in that then gets to the playoffs, that could be trouble if you're also in the playoffs. But it's all about risk. What risks are we willing to take? So, but I'm buying Burrow. I'm going to buy Joe Burrow.
Nice. I'm kind of in the same boat, I think. There's like you could probably, he's obviously been successful last few weeks, right? But you look at his ranking, you could probably talk to someone and say, hey, there's some risk there with the ankle, and
Yep.
Maybe also to try to get someone like you mentioned who has another good quarterback, a CJ Stroud, a Sam Howell, or others, right? Where they might value him a little less because they're like, well, I got another quarterback. Like, I don't mind getting another quality player, or look at that person and saying, hey, like they don't have a good wide receiver too, right? Like I will give you like a Michael Pittman plus something for that, right? And then they're like, oh, great, perfect, and it works out.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat as you though. Like I think I'm trying to buy at this point. If I need a quarterback, I'm desperate. I'm going to buy to try to make something happen. But
I think the key with that though is recognizing the buy low window passed about 3 weeks ago. So
yeah,
you can buy it, but you have to understand it's not you can't just look at, well, he's quarterback. I think by point scoring, he is quarterback. He's pretty down. He is quarterback 17. So you can't say, I'll give you Baker Mayfield for him, who sits at quarterback 16, because you know what the capability is. So you're going to have to pay a little bit more. So, yeah.
For sure.
So, all right, we have a fun slate of games this week, and we finally get an actual good game on Thursday night with the Ravens and Bengals. Speaking of Bengals, any bold predictions for the week in the NFL or fantasy from you?
Man. Oh man. Gosh, bold predictions. I think the Bengals Ravens game is going to be very low scoring. I think both teams have been playing better. It's going to be a low scoring game. And then of course we then have our, on Monday is the Kelsey Swift extravaganza that is going to be matched by maybe just the Super Bowl this year.
Probably.
Which that will be an interesting game too. And I can't get a read for that game. I don't know what I'm expecting. If it's going to be a high scoring game with two good quarterbacks, or it's going to be a defensive, slugfest. I can't really get a read for that game.
Yeah, Philly's secondary has been problematic. Like we just said earlier in the show, though, what has recently happened. So if they're not healthy, that could be problematic for Philly. But Philadelphia also has one of the best defensive lines, same as Kansas City. So it's strength on strength, because they both have good offensive lines too. So, yeah, I have a hard time getting a read on that. But at this point, if it's within a score, I'm going to lean Mahomes just because he has done it year in, year out. And until he shows otherwise, that's pretty much what it is. So, I'm going to say my bold take, and it's probably not even that bold, right? But the bold take I have is the Jets are going to beat the Bills this week. The Bills are kind of reeling. The Jets are going to go into Buffalo and win this week.
Yeah, the Bills have been, I think, one of the bigger, both the Bills and the Bengals.
Yep,
have been a pretty big disappointment. I think we were all expecting a big four-headed horseman of the Chiefs, the Dolphins, the Bengals, and the Bills to just be right at the top there in the AFC. And I think there's some separation there. I think it's the Chiefs just recently beat the Dolphins, of course, in Germany last week.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, it's surprising. The Bills at 5-5 is I was not expecting that at all.
Yeah, I mean, both the Bills and the Bengals are honestly playing for their playoff positions right now.
Yeah, they are.
If the Bengals lose, that could be their season. If the Bills lose, that also very well could be their season. I think in the AFC, they need at least 10 wins to make the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
But, all right, well, as we wrap up then and prepare we have week 11, and then following week 11, obviously, is holiday week, where it's the best Thursday game slate because it's 3 games on Thanksgiving. So we will hopefully have a good week as we prepare our teams for the next, hopefully, step towards making the playoffs in fantasy. But to those out there, good luck week 11, and may all your fantasy dreams for football come true.